Now we're going to look at the book of Proverbs. The book of Proverbs. When you look at the book of Proverbs, to give you a basic description of it, Proverbs was written mainly by King Solomon. Now there are two other authors that appear in the book. They're later in the book, and you'll see that when we look at the arrangement of the book. But it's Agur and Lemuel. But the primary author of the Proverbs is King Solomon. And when you look at the book of Proverbs, you'll see that it is written in poetical genre. So the book of Proverbs, when you examine the book, what it does, it serves the purpose of attempting to impart practical wisdom that should govern a person's life. That's the idea. This book, though, it's not like Paul's writing in Romans. This book's not presenting long theological treatises like Paul would do in the book of Romans, talking about sin and justification, sanctification, those kinds of things. Proverbs is written, yes, in a different genre, but it has a different purpose. And the purpose is to be practical in nature. Again, this is where you really see that wisdom genre be displayed. Because here, King Solomon is trying to help the readers to think practically about their life. He wants them to consider, to look, to listen to this, think about this, beware of this. There are places in the Proverbs where Solomon is speaking like a father to a son, giving his son practical advice about how to live in the world and live for God. The one thing that sometimes is confusing for people is they think that the book of Proverbs is all about giving promises. That it's like a wish list. That if you do this, you get this promise. This is a promise that you can claim. And Proverbs contains all of these promises. The reality is, it's not a book of promises. It's a book of practical wisdom, written in very short statements in how to live. And as a result, they're not written as though they're complete and binding commands. You can choose not to follow it. They're not written in the style of thou shalt not, like a legal binding code. They're not promises either. Tom Constable, he is a biblical scholar or teacher, and he commented on the book of Proverbs, and this is off of his notes that he has on Proverbs. Proverbs are statements that paint a small word picture of what life is like or should be like. A proverb is like a snapshot of life. However, as with every snapshot, a proverb does not always represent what life always looks like. One picture does not capture everything. So a good proverb, like a good snapshot, captures what is typical. There are exceptions to the Proverbs. They are not always true, but they are usually true. They represent life accurately, but not completely. Visualize a photograph of a waterfall. It accurately represents a typical waterfall, but it does not picture every feature of every waterfall. Even every waterfall in the locale where that picture was taken. Some waterfalls look quite different, though all waterfalls share certain things in common that this picture shows. So he continues. The Proverbs, they're not commands. They're different from that law subgenre that exists under narrative genre. What they are revelations of what will usually follow, what will usually happen, the implications if you do certain things. In other words, the book of Proverbs exists to help teach people how to think before they may act and do. Consider these things. If you do this, it's going to lead you here. If you do these things, generally speaking, it's going to take you here. And this could be a good thing, or he may be talking about a bad thing. It represents practical wisdom that one should follow because of how God has previously instructed his people in his law and throughout his dealings with them during their history. So the idea is, yes, take God at his word, the law that was given to us, follow it, obey it. But when you think about your living in this world, let me fill in the gaps for you. Give you certain scenarios that may take place in your life. And if you find yourself in that situation, you may want to respond to that situation in the following way. That's how Proverbs are written. They're not promises to claim for yourself. It's practical wisdom. And it's written from the mindset that you need to think about how you live. You need to think about how you live in this world. What actions are you going to do? What are you going to beware of? What are you going to actually do in this world? And we'll look at the central message of the book in a little bit. But I want to give you an understanding that when you think about the book of Proverbs, don't think of them as promises to claim or a list of these imperatives that are complete in every detail. Proverbs are like pictures and a snapshot of things. It may not give you everything. It may not tell you every ramifications. But it's there as practical wisdom to give you guidance so that you understand how to think before you do and before you act. Now, when you think about the arrangement of the book of Proverbs, how it is arranged, some believe that the book of Proverbs has no organization at all. I mean, it's just one statement here, another one here, another one here, another one here. But that it's only really like a loose collection of wise sayings. But the opposite is however true. There is an arrangement here. And you want to be familiar with that arrangement. Now, there are challenges to preaching the book of Proverbs. And we'll talk about that in class. But I want to make sure you understand this arrangement. Again, I'm not going to go through these verses, but I will at least lay this before you to give you a perspective. If you want to see how the book is arranged, you first got to look at the first 7 verses. That's like an introduction to the book's purpose and goal. And we're going to talk about the central message next. But the introduction is laid out in those 7 verses. And then what you have it's like a collection. I call it a collection. Now, Proverbs is not a story. It's not written like Job. Remember I told you that each of the books, Job, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon, even though they're similar in that they're trying to impart practical wisdom, how they impart that wisdom is different from each book. Job is written like a story. Proverbs is written more like a collection. So all these wise sayings, all these statements that have been made, it's like they're collected and put together in some kind of an arrangement, a general arrangement. So the chapter 1 verse 8 to chapter 9 verse 18, it's the first collection of Solomon imparting wisdom like a father would to his son. You find a lot of places in those verses, in those chapters, where Solomon is the father speaking to a son. And then the next collection, Solomon is imparting wisdom through short statements of instruction, dealing with various topics, various issues. And that becomes a large portion of the book of Proverbs. Collection number 3, he's imparting wisdom by providing a series of warnings. So you see how just the way it's arranged, what Solomon's doing is think about this and beware of this. These are warnings. So they're collected together. Collection number 3. And then in collection number 4, Solomon is imparting wisdom which relates to various issues. So it may seem unrelated. One verse here, and you like, what is going on? Well, they're just like a bunch of sayings, and they make no sense to each other. Well, sometimes it's difficult, and this is one of the challenges that we'll talk about, is the context of the book of Proverbs. Understanding the historical context, it's very, very difficult to understand that. However, you've got to understand, too, that these are sayings that were made over periods of years by Solomon, things that he knew, things that he had learned, and he wanted to impart this practical wisdom. And all of these things are collected together into this kind of an arrangement to put them together so that they're codified so that people can read them, like you and I, in previous generations and even future generations. Now, the last collection was by Agur and Lemuel, imparting wisdom concerning various issues that they have, that they wanted to discuss, chapters 30 and chapters 31. And you're familiar, many are familiar with chapter 31 about the excellent wife. So Lemuel is talking about what is an excellent wife. He's describing that. So when you see the arrangement, know that it's not just a various loose collections of sayings, but they are put together in some kind of an arrangement that will help give you guidance to see that they are structured in a certain way by these various collections that have been put together. So Proverbs is about imparting practical wisdom. Imparting practical wisdom. So how does that work out? What's the overall central message of the book of Proverbs? That's what we're going to look at next. Now, the book of Proverbs, when you think about its central message, the book of Proverbs is this collection of instructions and true wisdom, practical wisdom. But all of these wise sayings that are collected together, they're built upon one premise, one guiding premise, and that is the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. And Solomon says that in chapter 1, verse 7. So everything that comes after that introduction, all these wise sayings, they have the premise, what fuels the practical wisdom that is given is the idea that the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. And if you think about that arrangement, it is arranged in such a way to defend that premise, while at the same time providing many examples to show how it is important to live one's life in accordance with that premise. And so if you're going to live your life considering that premise, that the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, then what the book of Proverbs wants you to do, what the goal of the book of Proverbs is to think about the implications of what it means to fear the Lord. If you truly fear the Lord, this is how you want to think. This is how you want to process what happens to you daily. Tom Constable again comments about the importance of the premise of this statement from chapter 1, verse 7. He says, there is a presupposition in that statement. It is that God is the repository of wisdom. We can only find wisdom in God ultimately. This fundamental affirmation also contains an inevitable deduction. If wisdom is perfect in God, then wisdom in man consists of the fear of God. A person is wise to the extent that he or she apprehends and fears God. And the fear of God does not mean a dread that results in hiding from God. It is rather an emotional recognition of God. This is the kind of fear that produces holy character, righteous conduct. Intellectual apprehension of God precedes this emotional recognition, and volitional submission to God's will follows it. In other words, when a person comes to have an emotional recognition of God, he fears God, he or she comes to the condition for being wise. Not that in so doing, he or she becomes wise. We can begin to be wise only when we come into proper relation to God as ultimate wisdom. You see, wisdom resides in Him and in Him alone. So you need to reverence Him, fear Him, honor Him, follow Him. Don't follow your own path. Don't follow what you may think is the wise course of action. Everything should be coming from fearing Him, honoring Him. And how that practically works out in your life depends on the circumstances that you face. You need to examine every circumstance, every situation, and follow the principles that come from fearing God. Fearing God. And the book of Proverbs is a collection of those implications, of those ways to think. It's the practical wisdom. That's how you want to look at the book of Proverbs. Now, saying kind of my final thoughts about the book of Proverbs before we begin to look at the book of Ecclesiastes in the next section, the next video. There's a good possibility that these statements that came from Solomon, that they may have come, even though, as you can see from his history, God gave him wisdom, but that these statements came later in life. When we look at the books of Ecclesiastes and Song of Solomon, those books especially, you have to think about the history of Solomon. You have to go back and examine that and look at his history. And there's a good possibility that the book of Proverbs was written later in his life, near the end, after he had experienced what he experienced. He learned a lot of lessons, learned some valuable lessons. God showed him many things. The book of Proverbs is a helpful book. It's not a book of promises that you're to claim. But the premise is fear God. Yes, obey that. Thou shalt fear God. That is the command that overrides this book. But how does that practically work out in your life? If you're going to fear God, you need to follow after Him and make wise choices. Make choices that honor Him, that come from obeying Him and following Him and reverencing Him. Don't make the choices that are going to lead you to disaster and lead you away from God. Think about the implications for your life of what it means to truly serve God and follow Him. That's what Proverbs is about. And in our class, we're going to deal with, just like we did with Job, we're going to look at Proverbs and examine some of the challenges of preaching the book of Proverbs to your congregations. Okay? So that is the book of Proverbs. That's kind of what it's about. I look forward to our time in class when we can examine some of the challenges in preaching this great, great book.